They taped a removal notice on my boat like I was some criminal. I wasn't even docked on HOA land, but that didn't stop them. What they didn't expect was that I owned the very easement their marina depended on, and I was done playing nice. If you've ever been bullied by people in power, this true story will hit home. Make sure to subscribe for stories they try to bury. It started with a bright orange sticker flapping against the morning breeze. I found it slapped across the cabin window of my old trawler, which bobbed gently in the quiet waters of the lake I'd visited since childhood. The words were bold. Violation. Remove immediately. I stood on the dock, wind cutting through my jacket, and read it twice to believe it. The HOA, the same group that had only recently extended their reach toward the northern marina, was now claiming my boat was out of compliance. But I didn't live under HOA rule. I never had. My property was adjacent to the marina, separated by a strip of grassy bluff and a thin, forgotten easement that no one cared about until the lakefront started booming with new money and gated homes. My family had used the easement for generations, not just to access the water, but to maintain irrigation, bring in hay, even launch small canoes. We owned it outright. The marina? That had been built decades later, and as far as I knew, they'd never filed for updated access rights. It was overlooked, forgotten, ignored. Until now. I pulled the notice from the glass and read the smaller print. Failure to comply within 48 hours will result in removal at owner's expense. It was signed by Karen Whitfield, acting HOA enforcement chair. That name had been floating around recently, usually attached to complaints, sudden fines, arbitrary enforcement, ticketing of guests. But this was different. This was trespass disguised as regulation. My boat wasn't on HOA property. It was docked on the southernmost tip of the marina, right beside the old retaining wall I maintained myself. A wall I legally owned. I didn't act immediately. Instead, I spent the day digging. Not with a shovel, with paper. I retrieved the original deed my grandfather had signed in 1964, one that described the lakefront access corridor, in precise detail, marked in red pencil with his signature still visible. Then I pulled tax records, 10 years' worth, showing continued private maintenance, fencing logs, even storm repair costs billed under my name. The HOA had never paid a dime toward this stretch of land or its upkeep. The next day, I drove into the HOA office, a prefab building with plastic siding and flower pots out front, and asked for Karen. She wasn't there. The receptionist looked uneasy when I showed her the documents, especially the easement plat map. "You'll have to bring that up at the next board meeting," she said weakly. I didn't wait. I walked the perimeter of the easement that afternoon, flagged its edges with orange tape, and called a fencing contractor from 2 towns over. "Full perimeter," I told him. "Chain link. Reinforced posts." Work started the next morning. The fence went up fast, double height with barbed overrun at the top. The kind used for agricultural livestock, but good enough to make a point. Within 48 hours, the entire northern edge of the marina, the part built partially on my easement, was sealed off from the lake. Boats were stuck. Docks were inaccessible. Angry calls started pouring in, and HOA reps showed up by the dozen. But they had no jurisdiction. I had the deeds, the maps, and a clear chain of ownership. Karen arrived last, stepping out of a white Lexus with HOA plates and fury in her walk. She marched up to the fence line, barking demands at the contractor, but he pointed to me. "I'm not breaching anything," I said calmly, holding the survey map like a shield. "This is my land. You should have checked your records before trying to intimidate me off it." Her eyes scanned the terrain, realization dawning. She'd built power on assumption, not fact, and that foundation was collapsing fast. That night, I walked the property line under the moonlight, the fence now gleaming silver against the calm lake. I felt something I hadn't in months: peace. Not revenge, not smugness. Just peace. The kind you feel when boundaries are respected. I knew this wasn't over. Karen would dig. She'd twist, file, threaten. But for now, I had reclaimed not just my right to dock, but the integrity of ownership. 2 days later, I received a letter from the county zoning office, a complaint filed by the HOA claiming unauthorized obstruction of community access. I sent them a 23-page packet of my own, copies of deeds, maintenance receipts, and historical maps. The silence that followed was deafening. No follow-up. No citations. Just silence. Meanwhile, the Marina sat half inaccessible, a monument to overreach. As the fence stood firm and the HOA scrambled, I sat on the deck of my boat, coffee in hand, watching ducks ripple across the glassy water. Karen's notice had done something unexpected. It had reminded me that in the face of bureaucratic bullying, paper is louder than noise, and truth is sharper than power. I smiled, folded the violation notice in half, and used it as kindling in the fire pit. The calm didn't last long. By Monday morning, the county had received 3 more complaints, all signed anonymously but clearly rooted in the HOA's desperation. The charges ranged from blocking emergency access to environmental hazard creation, each one filed with the precision of someone used to weaponizing red tape. I anticipated it. Bureaucratic pressure was the HOA's tool of choice. But they were sloppy this time. None of the accusations aligned with county zoning maps, and all relied on assumptions that the land in question was part of their jurisdiction. It wasn't. I drove down to the zoning office with everything I needed, not just deeds and plats, but photographs, maintenance logs, and even drone footage from last spring that showed me reseeding the bluff by hand. The clerk, a weary man with glasses perched low on his nose, flipped through the files slowly. After 10 minutes he looked up. "They're grasping at straws," he muttered, more to himself than to me. I nodded. He stamped the documents, updated the digital record, and added a formal note. "Private easement. Not subject to HOA enforcement." It was all I needed. Word spread fast. Within 2 days, the Marina parking lot sat half empty. Boats that were usually prepped for weekend launch remained tarped and tethered. The HOA issued a statement to its members, vague and stiff, claiming temporary restricted access due to unforeseen boundary disputes. But whispers traveled faster than paper. Some residents began calling me directly, asking to rent slip space or renegotiate usage rights. I refused politely. My easement wasn't a business. It was my line in the sand. Karen, however, wasn't done. She called a special board meeting at the clubhouse, the kind filled with quiet fury and performative outrage. I didn't attend, but a friend who lived in the HOA texted me updates in real time. There were mentions of lawsuits, counter easements, even claims that I had stolen lake access from the community. The irony was rich. Their entire project had been built on the assumption no one would push back. But now, the fence had become a symbol. Not just of property lines, but of resistance. Days turned to a week, and then came the legal notice. A courier dropped off the envelope at my gate, a thick stack with the HOA's letterhead, warning colors, and a demand to cease obstruction of shared infrastructure. Their case leaned heavily on a single, weak point, that their access to the Marina, though informal, had become communal through consistent use. They were invoking adverse possession, despite not having maintained, taxed, or formally recognized the easement in any of their filings. I knew what it meant. They were testing me. I didn't panic. I lawyered up. My attorney, an old friend from college who specialized in land disputes, read through the HOA's letter and chuckled. "This is hollow," he said. "No court will uphold this without a decades-long history of maintenance or recorded legal rights." Still, we responded professionally, a formal rebuttal, complete with documentation, and a subtle warning: any further action would trigger discovery. I knew the HOA board wouldn't want that. Their records were fragile, patched together, and likely full of holes. A courtroom would tear them apart. Then something shifted. A week later, Karen's Lexus stopped appearing at the Marina. Her name disappeared from board memos. A quiet resignation, rumored but unconfirmed, rippled through the neighborhood. No announcement, no press. Just absence. It was like the HOA had pulled its queen off the board without warning. In her place, a new spokesperson emerged, calmer, softer spoken, and far more careful with words. They asked for a community dialogue. I agreed. But only in writing. The letter I sent back was measured. I explained that while the Marina's southern dock had been informally used, no permission had ever been granted. I offered a compromise, a formal lease agreement at market value, renewable annually under strict terms. I wouldn't reopen access freely. But I would allow the community to negotiate, fairly, lawfully. I heard nothing for 2 weeks. Then a single envelope arrived, thin and unremarkable. We accept the terms outlined. Please forward a draft agreement. Just like that, the tide shifted. I didn't celebrate. I had learned that battles like this rarely ended with a bang. They faded out, like storms passing through quiet valleys. I drafted the agreement with my lawyer's help, included clauses for maintenance responsibilities, liability, and annual review. It wasn't about money. It was about control, the right to decide how my property was used, and to never be threatened again by a clipboard-wielding official with no true authority. By the time the season turned and the lake grew colder, the fence still stood, a quiet monument to a lesson learned the hard way. Residents now stepped around it with respect. Boats were back, but under new rules. The HOA, bruised and humbled, kept its distance. And I tied my boat off each evening, poured coffee as the sun dipped behind the trees, and watched the ripples of the lake dance gently beneath the dock I had reclaimed, not just with metal and paperwork, but with patience and grit. Autumn had set in with a kind of stillness that wrapped the lake like a blanket. Leaves floated quietly along the marina's edge while my mornings began with checking the fence, ensuring no one had tampered with the padlocks or signage. Each bolt and bracket was intact. The silence was almost unsettling. No HOA notices, no angry emails, no unannounced surveys. For an organization once so vocal, their retreat felt orchestrated. But I didn't mistake quiet for surrender. I assumed they were regrouping, or worse, digging into legal back channels. Yet nothing came. Weeks passed. The community grew used to the new normal. I watched from my deck as families adjusted their launch routines. Some had accepted the lease terms and used the southern end of the dock under strict scheduling. Others avoided the marina entirely, parking farther down the shoreline, grumbling but compliant. No one challenged the new boundaries. It was as if the fence had been there for years, not weeks. I had expected escalation. Instead, I was met with adaptation. That's when I began hearing rumors. Whispers, really, from a few neighbors who still treated me as a friend, not a villain. They told me the HOA was fractured. Half the board blamed Karen's aggressive tactics for the legal fallout, while the others quietly acknowledged I had done nothing wrong. Some even admired the way I had handled it, calm, methodical, never resorting to public drama. A new vote was scheduled to replace key leadership roles. My fence hadn't just protected my land, it had shaken the foundation of their power structure. I received a letter mid-October. Not an accusation this time, but an invitation. The HOA was forming a property rights subcommittee, and asked if I'd consider participating as an external advisor. It was surreal. The same group that once tried to label me as a threat now sought my input. I didn't respond immediately. I wasn't sure if it was genuine or a tactical move to bring me into their fold. The fence had bought me time, leverage, and peace. I wasn't about to trade it for politics. Instead, I walked the marina daily, documenting the use of the dock, noting every rental, maintenance request, and access schedule. If this ended up in court someday, I wanted my records perfect. But as the days shortened and frost began to kiss the shoreline, it became clear there was no war left to fight. Not here. Not now. The HOA had blinked. Their silence wasn't just strategic, it was surrender cloaked in civility. One morning, I noticed something unusual. A work crew, not affiliated with the HOA, digging trenches near the upper road. I asked the supervisor, and he confirmed the town had approved drainage upgrades, part of a larger push to prevent future flooding. The irony didn't escape me. A year ago, the HOA had refused to contribute to a similar project, claiming it wasn't within their scope. Now, the city was taking matters into its own hands, bypassing the association entirely. The landscape was changing, and not just physically. It made me think, maybe this fence wasn't just about property. Maybe it symbolized something larger, the end of unchecked authority by those who thought proximity equaled ownership. The HOA had acted like they owned the lake because they'd always gotten away with acting like they did. But land doesn't care about assumption. It cares about deed, responsibility, history. And I had all three on my side. I finally replied to the HOA's invitation, not with a commitment, but a suggestion. I recommended they publish their enforcement authority boundaries clearly, educate residents about real versus perceived rights, and issue a formal apology to those they'd wronged. I didn't expect them to act on it. But I wanted it on record that someone had drawn the line, literally and figuratively. To my surprise, they responded. A newsletter was distributed a week later, dry in tone, but notable in content. It included a new map, clearly indicating common areas and privately deeded easements. It also acknowledged past misunderstandings and introduced new transparency measures. No names, no apologies. But progress nonetheless. For the first time, I felt the fence had done more than protect my space. It had reshaped theirs. By the time the first snow dusted the dock planks, I had added solar motion lights along the fence line and a small bench facing the water. Not as a warning, but as a reminder. This place, this battle, this outcome, it wasn't just about a boat. It was about holding the line when no one else would. And as winter settled in, and the lake turned to glass, I stood at the edge of my reclaimed shore and understood something simple but profound. Real ownership begins when you're willing to defend peace, not with noise, but with truth. Winter arrived fully now, the lake glazed over in silence, and the air brittle with frost. The dock looked like a fossil beneath the snow, the fence posts casting long shadows under the pale morning light. I no longer expected retaliation, not from Karen, not from the HOA, not even from the city. The fight, for all its weight and strain, had resolved itself not with fire but with slow erosion. The kind of ending that doesn't announce itself, but simply settles. I kept to my routine. Coffee before dawn. Walk the fence. Clear the snow if needed. I even began mending the older sections of the easement path, not for the HOA, but for the families who had treated the space respectfully. They had stopped knocking. But now and then they waved from across the frozen water, a silent truce forming between us. The boundary I'd drawn didn't divide the people, it divided authority. That mattered. One frigid afternoon, a white envelope appeared in my mailbox. No logo, no return address. Just my name, typed cleanly in the center. Inside was a single-page letter. Typed. Polite. But from the tone, I knew exactly who wrote it. Karen. She had resigned. Quietly. She claimed. Health reasons. But the letter hinted at something deeper: exhaustion, shame, maybe even understanding. Her final line read, "I didn't realize how much fear shapes power, and how much courage breaks it." I read it twice, then burned it in the wood stove. Not out of anger. Out of closure. The woman who once knocked on my door with threats had become a name fading in snow. And I didn't need trophies from battles I no longer wished to remember. What mattered was that my boat still rocked gently under its tarp, my shoreline remained untouched, and the deed with my name on it sat unchallenged in a safe under my stairs. February brought storms. Ice fractured in deep, echoing cracks beneath the surface. I watched it from the deck, wondering how something so solid could splinter so quietly. Just like this neighborhood. The HOA still existed, but it was no longer feared. The new leadership had embraced documentation, transparency, and actual dialogue. I heard from a few neighbors that fees were being reduced, enforcement policies rewritten. No one credited me, but they didn't have to. By early March, I saw something that made me pause: a small wooden dock being built at the far end of the lake, outside HOA jurisdiction, on public easement land. Some young families had pooled together to create a shared access point. No vote. No approval. Just cooperation. It felt like the ice had shifted beneath all of us. Maybe it took a stubborn man and a fence to remind them what community used to mean before signatures and fines clouded it. A local journalist eventually published a column titled, "The Fence That Moved the Lake." It told the story not of rebellion, but of resistance, of knowing when to say no and when to say nothing. My name was changed in the piece. But those who lived nearby knew who it was. The article made rounds. HOA reform blogs picked it up. Some called it inspiring. Others called it overblown. I didn't care. It was never about going viral. It was about standing still while the storm tried to move you. Spring arrived quietly, sneaking into the thaw with bird song and warm soil. I took down one panel of the fence, just one, and replaced it with a swinging gate. Locked still, but symbolic. Not as an invitation, but as a message. I had nothing to hide, but everything to protect. That was always the point. Not revenge. Not spite. Just the right to live without being stepped over. People started visiting again. Cautious at first. Then comfortable. A few even apologized, not for siding with the HOA, but for staying silent when I was being harassed. I accepted every apology with a nod. No need for speeches. The wind and lake did the talking. The fence had not only restored my boundary, it had rebuilt the town's compass. Now, when I sit on the dock, my dock, and watch the ripples roll in, I think about that first letter demanding I remove my boat. A letter written by someone who had no authority, backed by a system that relied only on fear. But fear has no roots. And roots, I learned, go deeper than fines, fences, or flags. They live in deeds, in legacy, and in the quiet defiance of a man who simply says, "No. This is mine. And I'm not moving."